There were no books for me to read in order to understand what I was going through as a kid. I released the deepest and darkest things about my past in the hopes that someone might see a reflection of themselves in the words and know that they are not alone and they too can grow and thrive. Welcome to the Banned Bookshelf. I figured that for my very first video on this channel, it was only appropriate to look at the number one most banned book in the country, All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson. Let's look at what makes this book so controversial, why it's been challenged over and over again ever since it was first published, and more importantly, what its intrinsic value is, why you should read it. Before I start looking at the book itself, I actually want to point something out. So I do like to collect the majority of my books. I prefer physical copies, but I do read ebooks, and I've now recently accepted that audiobooks are books too, and I've started to listen to books. I still prefer the actual book, but for this one, I have one that's on the way. I mean, it's so important. I feel like I have to have a copy, so I'm getting one any day now. But I read this book as an ebook, and I want to tell you where because this is important. If you want access to a lot of these books and you just want to know where the most banned books can be found, I have discovered a lot through the Palace app. They have something called the Banned Book Library, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a free online library. So if you download the app, and you can do this on Android or Apple, you just add the library. It is simple, it is quick, and voila, you can not only read these books online, but also they have audio versions. And I have to admit, this is how I learned about a lot of different titles, not just discovering them for the first time, but discovering that they are banned or challenged. And I continue to be astounded as to why sometimes, even after reading or listening to these books. So this one, it seems obvious. So if you just look at the cover, if you listen to the title of the book, All Boys Aren't Blue, you know it's getting challenged and you know why. This book, I don't know if you call it biography, it's more of a memoir, a series of essays, if you will, not necessarily going straight chronologically through George Johnson's life, but talking about his search for his own identity, his struggle, for numerous reasons. Number one, obviously, is race, coming up as a young black man, but then also the gender identity coming up and growing up as a young gay or LGBTQ man. Now, this book has a lot of different personal stories, again, from his time as a young child to all the way as a teen and then through college, and how all of those different experiences, both positive and negative to be sure, formed who he is and gradually, thankfully, gave him the courage to write this down and to share his story. We get to know Johnson's family throughout, both of his parents, his siblings, his grandmother, who was a big influence on him, and of course, some of his friends as well. And he really digs through his most profound memories, those who made a lasting impression on him, for better or for worse. Why is this book banned? Well, again, it's pretty obvious from the title why this was going to be challenged. Anything that in any way challenges the traditional gender roles that society's upheld is going to be a threat, and especially coming from a minority group. Among the more specific reasons this book has been challenged throughout the years, again, ever since it was first published, some of those challengers have cited, quote, inaccurate gender information, unnatural homosexual lifestyle, and explicit sexual content. To be clear, that last point is accurate. There is some explicit sexual content in this book. George Johnson, in his memoir, details his early sexual encounters, his first as a queer male, and also discusses his incident of sexual assault when he was young. This is absolutely a mature topic, should be taken seriously by its readers. And at the same time, this book is intended, at least where it's available publicly, for those who are at least 14 or up. It is not meant to be a children's book, just like many other books that aren't supposed to be placed in those settings. But this is important for those who, in that population, may experience something, may want to understand how this could happen, and just for anybody who wants to be able to place themselves in the shoes of someone who could find themselves in that situation. We cannot simply just censor anything that we think is not rated G. What makes that particular passage difficult for Johnson to even write, and again, you really have to empathize with him. At least you should be capable of doing that if you actually bother to read this book. but this was somebody who was a relative of his, and he makes it clear throughout the end of that portion of the story abusers should be held accountable, and that's a very important lesson. For anyone who's challenged this book that might have actually read at least portions of it, may also be threatened not just by the fact that this was written by a queer black male, but the fact that it actually challenges the traditional thought of toxic masculinity. And George talks in a kind of humorous detail about how he always played sports and tried to make sure he played football growing up and actually was pretty good at it. He was athletic, and so it's not like he stood out, but always making sure that while he actually would prefer to play some of the games with the girls at recess, and he did, he actually played football just as well. And that's one way he, quote unquote, fit in to his peer group. Challenging traditional gender roles is tough enough, but especially for someone in the African American community, you can imagine this was especially difficult for him. Bear in mind, this book is not all just about the challenges and the tough parts. He has many joyous occasions. He talks about joining a fraternity in college. He has great memories with his grandmother, with his friends, and so this book is also uplifting as well as informative. I thought it was especially interesting where he discussed the idea of code switching, meaning using language very specifically in order to switch, in his mind and his identity, from male to female in terms of how he talked to different groups of people, and also from black to white. In one portion of the story, he talks about how he started using the phrase honey child, and he using that with his female friends, and then when he got caught using it at home with his family, it raised an eyebrow, and he had to be careful about what he was saying when. And so this is kind of his way of blending in without being too conspicuous. And to me, the most profound part of the story is how he basically explains the bigger concept of gender identity, which is a huge topic to be sure, and there's many other books we could talk about that address that in different ways. But basically, how we are gendered even before we are born now. We talk about gender reveal parties. Clothing has to be very specific towards what sex the baby's going to be, and you're basically labeled before you even exist. So you can see why, even though this is clearly a very controversial book, it's not only very interesting to read, but it was illuminating in a lot of different areas. So I can only imagine how it feels for George M. Johnson after hearing the reception of this book, all the backlash. On the other hand, I want to say thank you, those who have challenged this and made this number one most challenged book, because honestly, they've done us a favor by bringing this story to the forefront. It's ironic and kind of funny how a lot of times these challenges, these bans backfire on those who are trying to suppress these stories, this information, because now we know more about it. If you go look, and of course I encourage you to look at the list of the most challenged, the most banned books, find out why they don't want you to read this. And this book has gotten so much more attention because of the bans. And because of that, now I hope more people are aware of the story. It's hard to say exactly how long this book is going to stay on the most challenged lists. I can't imagine it's going to drop off anytime soon. May not be number one. I'm sure something will take its place eventually, but as you can see from the current political climate, it's going to be there for a while. If you haven't read All Boys Are Blue, highly recommend it. It's not a difficult read, and I don't mean that just in terms of readability, in terms of the language, but as far as the topics, sure, there are some serious, tough topics in there. That's why it's an essential read, but also it's not something that is overly explicit or off putting. And to end with Johnson's own words, will this part of my story be met with pushback? Absolutely, but I'll be damned if I don't tell it because of that. Please support the author and fight censorship. Get a copy of All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson.